Our first presenter this afternoon is Shane Kent from OpenLegacy. Shane is the General Manager of North America. He oversees pre-sales, sales, and customer success, and is a key contributor and stakeholder in the overall product marketing and marketing functions. He spent the past 20 years building high-performance organizations, and his presentation today is your organization surviving or thriving in this API age? Everybody, give it up for Shane.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much. Very excited about being here. I thought, I was able to sit in on a few sessions this morning, and I thought the panel was excellent. I really enjoyed the aspect of the business transformation coming together with the IT transformation, and seeing that dialogue and that tension, because it's something that we obviously see all the time. So to give you a little bit more background on myself, I joined OpenLegacy in February of this year, specifically to build the North America market. So I spent the past 5 years prior to OpenLegacy with a company by the name of Talend. So if you're familiar with the open source, data integration space, Informatica, ab initio, I had the opportunity to participate with Talend over the last 3 years as we grew it from 50 million to 210 million, took it public. And I was running the Americas business, and I was looking to go through an exercise or find a company that I thought represented the same type of opportunity, but even earlier in its life cycle. And so that's really what it is here at OpenLegacy. So I'm going to maybe take a little bit of a different approach, probably try and be a little bit provocative in some of the discussions, and maybe take a little bit of a different approach to asking questions, and hopefully get everyone to think about things maybe a little bit differently. Because what wasn't mentioned is prior to the 20-year software career is, the first 10 years was really about consulting, operation consulting, performance management consulting. And so I've found that to provide tremendous value as we're going in and talking about value and impact and measuring results and things like, is your company thriving or surviving, as part of our overall approach to the market. So for my overall session, really what I'm going to focus on are 3 themes. The first being thriving or surviving in this API age, in this digital transformation age, and we'll talk about that in a second. Optimization versus transformation. And I view this as, is it an evolution? Is it more transactional? Or is it truly disruptive? Is it transformational? Is it, move the needle type of impact? And then as everyone has, represented in the various sessions today, about speed. Speed wins, speed kills. Speed is certainly the piece that ultimately defines success or not success. And so I guess first question, I'm going to assume the answer is not many. Had anybody heard of OpenLegacy prior to today? There you go. That's exactly why we're here. So that's a good start. Secondly, if I asked, raise hands, who would define or describe their organization as surviving? Let's start with surviving. Okay. Come on, be honest. You can be honest because I'm going to challenge you to be honest. All right. So we got maybe 10%. So the rest of everybody else, 80%, the organizations are thriving. That's sort of my takeaway. Right? Now, what's interesting is, and you see all sorts of studies that touch on this, 40% of companies will not exist in less than 10 years. Now, I take that as, well, certainly we've got market disruptions and things of that nature, but 85% of us think our companies are thriving or our initiatives are thriving. And so, okay, how do we reconcile that? How do we balance those 2 pieces? Now, we all know that the pace of change of technology and the types of companies over the last, it's the last 10 years in particular, has been incredible. When I was at Talend, we went from, it was on-prem, it was cloud, it was open source, it was perpetual, it was subscription, it was machine learning, it was big data, it was IoT, and it went on and on and on. These are exactly the reasons why speed is so important, and we talk about agility. I mean, it's really because of these things. The challenge, though, is you have so many different solutions, so many different paths coming towards you. How do you know which are the right ones? And then the other stat that wasn't up there, but I used this a couple years ago and I looked it up again today, was I think since 1955, there are only 5 companies that are left from the Fortune 500, right? That's change. That's the magnitude of change. And so, clearly these guys are about speed, right? The evolution. Part of, the question that I always ask and the perspective that I take is, how do you know, right? I asked everyone whether they're thriving or surviving. Is it a gut feel? Is it, material? Are you quantifying it? Are you able to say, you know what? Yep, this is what I look at. This is how I view. We've got this checklist, these benchmarks, these metrics, these items that says, I'm good. I'm actually thriving. We're thriving as an organization. Now, from what I've seen, I would be a bit skeptical of whether that's the case. But the reason and I've been given this presentation before, but the reason I use this is because I can guarantee you that if you asked each one of these guys or pieces or people that were supporting it, they would tell you at that point in time they were thriving, right? They were thriving, but very quickly becomes obsolete. And so, are you thriving? We asked that question. How do you know? What do these answers look like? And what I find and what I see in terms of meeting with organizations, and I meet with all levels of organizations, from developers and operations analysts to VPs, head of architecture, CIOs, CFOs, and I always ask the same question. How do you know, right? Because if you're going to tell me, yes, we're successful, we're good, we have a great strategy, we've got a great approach, we're hitting our Scrum numbers, we're hitting our sprint on time, but what does that really tell me? Within the context of what? And so where do you go to ask questions, to answer those questions? We typically go to, all right, well, let's check, do we have a backlog, right? So everyone that said that their organization is thriving, they've got well-controlled backlog of services or requirements or jobs to build or whatever it may be, everything's under control there. Time to market. What are we doing from a time to market perspective? Do I have good visibility into, business puts in a service request and we turn that around in terms of a completed service contract, let's say I'm talking about APIs, in 60 days, 90 days, 120 days. And we're measuring that on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. So these are what tend to be some of the different areas, right? We're trying to migrate our technical debt. We're putting in place a legacy, a DevOps environment, but tend to be more subjective, shall we say. What I challenge organizations, because this ultimately ties back to my business model and what I'm representing and how I know our platform impacts organizations, is how do you operationalize your particular businesses? How do you operationalize all of the various touch points that exist across designing, developing, building, QA, security, networking, management, administration, governance, all of the people and resources and labor hours associated with supporting that particular project, and convert that into a unit metric, right? How many people have metrics like that, where operationally, because all of your scrums, all of your projects, all of your sprints ultimately can roll into a high-level metric that establishes a trend and a baseline of what your overall performance is. And what I would say, because I've seen this over and over and over again, not only here, but over my 25 years, is if you don't have visibility into that, or you're not tracking it, and it isn't a key metric at the executive level, then you really don't know how you're doing, or whether, what the ultimate impact is, or whether you're driving out the value or the ROI that you were intended to from the process improvement investment or the software implementation that you just purchased. And so that becomes very, very critical. So a little bit of a different approach, a little bit of a different eye, but I know that, if we go back to 40% of companies won't be around in 8 years, 9 years. If we look at the 1955 to today, I mean, that's a long period of time. Change happens, acquisitions, distributions, et cetera. But everyone, each step along the way, I mean, that's the answer I typically get is, 85, 95%, we're good. We're thriving, we're hitting our targets, we're on schedule, our projects are on schedule, and we're good. And so what I would say is take a different view, a different glance at it, and see, okay, well, what can I do then to be, instead of, I would view this as being optimizing, so optimizing versus transformational, right? This is optimizing within whatever projects, programs, approaches that you've put in place versus how do I truly become transformational? And this is the age-old question, right? I think we talk about speed, and when we get into these discussions, there's always a reason why it's more optimizing versus transformational. Everybody's got the same objective and goal. They want to make improvement. They want to move faster. They want to deliver on the business needs. The reality is, you see it all the time. We've got 75 or 80% of our annual budgets associated with legacy spend, and we're getting budget cut pressure. And then, of course, you tie in the legacy with all of the modernization and everything that's attempted. It tends to become very challenging to actually move to a transformational model. And so, this brings me to, and I'll go through some use cases here, really, from an OpenLegacy perspective. And, I may be a little bit provocative here, but what I would argue is one of the most, if not the most, disruptive platforms that's coming to market. And I've seen a lot of software, as I mentioned, Talent, Snowflake, Databricks, of course we had AWS, the impact to organizations is that significant that it forces evaluation. And that's actually why I loved Shree's comments this morning, the CFO guy, because his tension is, all right, well, what am I going to get from this? What am I going to get from this investment? What's the value going to be? And I can go to him ultimately and I can say, well, if you're looking at cost per API, we'll cut it in half. And we'll allow you to build them, generate them 20 times faster. Makes it an easy discussion to have. And ultimately, the background for that is, here's the traditional approach to integration architecture, SOA architecture, right? Some familiarity, there's going to be some variances. But, essentially, when we're going into organizations, we're seeing, they have the legacy assets at the bottom. Could be anything from mainframe to AS400, Tuxedo, Tandem. They're working in RPG or COBOL or Tuxedo, SAP, Oracle, across the board. And they continue to add into the integration layer, the SOA architecture, right? All of the requirements that are needed to try and serve the business. And of course, this has been built up over some time. I mean, I've been into some areas, we've been using this mainframe for 35 years. We can't possibly get off of it. We've tried at least a half a dozen times, and we have another initiative attempting to do that. And so you have your traditional SOA architecture all the way up and down the stack, and ultimately what ends up happening is business logic starts being built into the integration layer versus at the legacy asset layer, and then it becomes that much more complex and challenging when you're looking to continue to add. You know, this changed this over here, it has this knock-on impact over there, and that brings in complexity. And then you had what now is the API microservices, which of course has been around for, for a pretty long period of time. But the recognition of the degree of disruption that it can provide and the value as you move towards deconstructing the code, creating containers, having the runtimes on-prem or in the cloud or, whatever it may be, but essentially giving you more flexibility and compartmentalization of the code. And what are we doing? We're layering it on top of or layering it into our existing SOA architecture. And so the challenges that have existed, around the ESB and the SOA architecture now are still there, but, we've got a more modern architecture on top of that. And then really what we've done and the way we've approached it is not from the legacy asset, let's say IBM mainframe or AS400 and developing ZOS Connect and developing that from the legacy asset up, but taking the complete opposite approach and said from a services perspective or from an API or microservices perspective, if you were going to design a software platform, how would you do it? Design it from the top down. And ultimately, that's what we've done. So that representing any legacy asset as a Java POJO, that is a complete representation of that legacy asset, business logic, security concerns, all the source points up into an SDK that is a Java code generated platform that ultimately you can have access to the Java code. So once you've created your SDK or your abstraction layer or your representation for every single legacy asset, you now have a standard Java platform to be able to add any type of additional code, to be able to template, so that if you're creating or generating APIs, you've actually built in the templates. It's business specific or country specific or product unit specific nomenclatures, so that now you have an automatic code generating API microservice automatically out into a Swagger page. And this is one of the use cases. So if you go look back 15 years, there was a Latin American bank that was the #1 bank in Latin America. You fast forward here 15 years later, and they're #4. And so, the business goes out and they get a survey conducted to find out, what's happened, what's going on. And it turns out that their user experience on mobile apps and their flexibility and what that looks like, their customer experience, completely missed the millennials. So they completely missed the millennials. And as everyone knows, in the banking industry, it's all about, you want to get open checking accounts, you get hooked on the checking accounts, then you talk about insurance and mortgages and all of those particular pieces, and they completely missed it. So what did they do? They went to IT. And IT said, they said, we have this huge problem. We're missing our millennials, our customer experience isn't where it needs to be. It's a big challenge. They're like, we agree 100%, give us 30 months, and we'll build you an API factory platform. And they were like, okay, well that certainly doesn't do me any good. And so they went out into the market, they found OpenLegacy, and we stood the entire platform up, generating 10 APIs a week in 5 months. And so that's where speed versus duration has a massive impact. And so you can see, right, this is the representation of their architecture, all of the different layers and all of the different integration points. And the piece that I didn't touch on, or maybe I did slightly, but all of the resources, right? So if you think about all of the people that are a part of supporting and touching this project or this overall infrastructure. And then you go to this type of situation where, okay, now I can see why the entire thing is cleaned up. We're able to generate 10 APIs a week, and we're able to take out 50, 60% of the headcount associated with supporting it. That's quantifiable, that's material, that's move the needle, that is transformational. Another scenario, and these are typically what we're able to see, was Ilon, which, if you think about the way the architecture works with OpenLegacy, it's all about being able to deconstruct, break apart the entirety of the process. Typically what organizations, the challenge they have from a DevOps is, how do I isolate the mainframe, or how do I isolate the legacy asset? The way we put it into place, because the code is deconstructed, you now have the ability to completely optimize your DevOps process. And so Ilon actually took the opportunity to put in place an overall DevOps solution leveraging the OpenLegacy platform. Israeli company, Monolith, what I will say is, I've probably had 60 different customer meetings since February when I've been on board. I would say half of them start off with, we're good. We're good. I've been building APIs. We have 2,000 APIs in production. We were ahead of our time. We are good. Okay, well, let's peel that back a little bit and really understand what do you have working there. And it's more than just the initial build. It's actually, this is an API factory, because what Gartner is saying, that APIs essentially have a life cycle of 18 to 30 months. Before you refresh, you shut down, you recommission, you do something to it, right? And so part of the factory is modifications, changes, updates, decommissioning, actually treating an API like it's a product, and assigning product managers. I mean, that's where they see this going. So remember in the beginning when Alex said, stage 4, this is really setting the stage for stage 4. Similar story with Ilon, being able to deconstruct, put in place the various spaces to support a DevOps. You can see the architecture, working with all of the various architectural components in order to be able to leverage and execute on that. And ultimately, the results. And so, going from 4 months to 5 minutes, what tends to happen is when we have discussions, the higher we go in the organization, like if I have the conversation with a CIO, and you ask the question, like I would ask Shri, if I can tell you that I'm going to cut your cost, the entirety of your API lifecycle management in half, and you'll be able to generate APIs 10 times, 20 times faster, would you be interested in looking at that? You can't say no. And so when we go in and we do POCs, and we're up to 15 to 17 POCs, and then you come back and you show them in their environment that, like last week at Rogers Communication, where we come in across Tuxedo and AS400, and we stand up in 3 days 6 production-ready APIs, he's like, I had a year's worth of development budget, $20 million, lined up to be able to do that. I'll be able to cut that in half. That's moved the needle. That's transformational. More case studies. I won't bore you with additional case studies. But my challenge to you, and I'm certainly happy to take questions, is how do you go about taking a different view of how your organization is run, whether you're surviving or thriving, and how do we make sure that everyone in here is part of that 60% that companies that are around in 10 years. And so that's really my philosophy and my approach. Any questions? Not a single question.
I've got a question.
Sure.
sounds really awesome.
That's what everybody says. And I know it. Trust me, I know. So before I joined, I said, that just can't be.
Can't be true.
I say it cannot be true. I said it's too good to be true. And now I've seen, multiple POC readouts. I've seen the reaction of executives, which allows me to get up here and to state it, because we don't charge for the POC. We come in and we show it in less than a week. Ultimately, you make the call.
I mean, have you encountered certain legacy apps that you don't think you could have some kind of API framework to begin with for this to work? Where legacy platforms are just
Yes, the question is, have we encountered any legacy assets that we ran into trouble with because you need some type of API framework or fabric to be able to build? And no, actually, we are creating the fabric, right? We are creating the API and the platform for which to generate the API out to a Swagger page. Could be just because everybody's got a different approach. Everyone's got a different philosophy on microservices and what does that mean. But it's out, code generating out to a Swagger page. And whether you want to just use the SDK that is a representation of the entity, or you want to use multiple SDKs to string together to create a platform and choreograph, all of that is what we're doing. And the question I always get is, well, isn't that what MuleSoft does, or isn't that what Apogee does? And I'm actually meeting with both of them next week, because we actually unleash the APIs for them to manage and secure and do everything analytics around. We support them. The overall API is really a tech stack. It's an entire stack, right? You have to have that abstraction layer. And the way everyone has approached it to this point is from the individual asset up in a silo, each one of them, right? If you think about IBM, they've got their ZOS Connect. You think about SAP, they've got their BAPIs and their approach. You think about Tuxedo or Unisys or any of those, they've got theirs. So they're all focused on their particular ecosystem and optimizing their particular platform. We're taking this approach, right? It's horizontal, and we're standardizing on Java. So now you've isolated that legacy asset. So the demands on the RBG or the COBOL resources and the skill set, which there's always a challenge there, it's in a box. They give you everything you need, but you're not dependent on understanding every single source point and business logic that was built into this layer of infrastructure over the last 20 years, which is what creates the time and the challenges of ultimately creating a seamless build for an API. We isolate all of that, and then you're generating. I mean, the Rogers example, like I said, they actually are saying, no, they actually did it in 30 minutes. They did 6 APIs, 30 minutes each. We're like, we'll take an hour. Because if you go and ask organization, I didn't ask the question, I should have. How long does it take you now to build an API? Typically, if you're good, it's a few weeks. Typically, it's months. We've heard anything from 3 months to 6 months, longer, and having to go through the process each time. And once you set up this abstraction layer, which there's no question, if you think about it, it's really the intersection of all of the pain that tends to exist in the build process, because you have the resource limitations and constraints, you have all of the silos that exist that you have to go through, and we're opening all of that up. And that's why you get the type of results that you get. So I'm with you. Before I joined, I'm like, you guys, there's just no way. And actually, because, as I mentioned, we're really just building this. Now, we've brought on FIS, we brought in Liberty Mutual, and I've got another probably 10 customers lined up before the end of the year. But that's what I kept saying to them. I said, this just sounds too good to be true, but every time we did the POC, we got the same reaction. Fabulous POC, fantastic. I don't know if I mentioned this, but the Rogers guy referred to us as Harry Potter-esque type of thing, so it's like, yes, it's too good to be true, but fortunately, I know that, and as a startup, all right, well, let's do a POC, and I'll prove it to you. And you can make the decision based off of the results and the impact that we have. Good question. Other questions? Yes, sir.
Using APG right now on the cloud, so are you able to help for, you're using more APG
So right before this meeting, I was on the phone with the head of global partnerships at Apogee. And I've got the reps for Apogee bringing us into opportunities because what they see is they can leverage us to deconstruct the monolith. And so it's a win-win because we can stand ours up in less than a week, and then we unleash the APIs for them to manage. We turn over the SDK, and actually, I think I mentioned this, but we have an automatic as part of our platform, the Wizard. It automatically can hand off to Apogee or MuleSoft. So they can just incorporate it into their platform, into their runtimes, and off and running. I think we're good. Thanks, Alex. Thanks, everybody. If you have any questions, don't hesitate. We're out here, and we'll be here until the end of the day.